Hello. Firstly, I want to thank the organizers, Cosmin and Freya, for having me here, and also a special thanks to Chu Chang, who arranged my trip and recommended me. Thank you, and Jenny also. Today, I would like to talk about something that relates to the local historical narrative in mainland China. Based on one of my exhibition projects, which is called Permanent Abstraction, Epiphanies of a Modern Form in Escaped Totalities at Red Brick Museum in Beijing last year. So I would like to share with you many issues that are discussed in this exhibition and are related to the current cultural and artistic situation in China. Because it's been 3 days actually since the beginning of this conference, and actually this was a great gathering of different backgrounds and contexts of practice, which actually strikes me a lot, especially when I, learn a lot of, practice from South Asia, from Africa, and from other regions that are rarely known to, especially to Chinese practitioners. I can get very emotional because this is really touching. Sometimes we don't have to speak too much about the exhibition practice or specific works that we have dealt with. But sometimes it's really touching because it's really based on your very own urgency, why you want to do this, and sometimes also it relates to the very urgency that you and I somehow want to revisit our own history, to somehow to look at the origin of us and where we come from. And it is an identity problem issue actually, but also this is also something that is much more, how should I say, cosmopolitan in a way. So I think yesterday I talked to Katin about if this kind of sharing is functioning in a way, because we all come from very different backgrounds, and to be very honest, the communication could be it's very difficult actually, because we don't know each other before we met. So, but still, if we somehow talk about the locality, and somehow we chase for kind of an open-ended discussion in this kind of a circumstance, there'll be a way maybe to open up yourself, to come out of your own comfort zone, come out of your own enclosed structure, which I will talk about in my presentation. And maybe there's another possibility. There's another possibility for discussing subjectivity matter in a different way. So there are two parts actually in this presentation. In the first part, I want to begin with some basic observation on the socio-political context we as Chinese practitioners find ourselves in, and the very context that shapes the cultural consciousness, artistic practices, and art discourses in China. It is not necessarily an observation from collectivistic angle. On the contrary, I feel more obligated to articulate certain anxieties I personally have, but also shared with many of my art colleagues and friends in China. So what I'm about to talk about is critical. So in terms of general criticism, now that I am the outlier or outsider and hold a glory critical distance to China's art world and art practices. So in other words, I would like to or me as the other Chinese practitioners in China, I feel like entangled, in this situation, not an outsider. So it is the urgency that allows me to and pushes me to look at the present political and cultural realities, and how art, if you still believe in the creative and critical nature of art, positions itself in this context. It is not necessarily the social engagement of art I'm addressing here. So more importantly, it refers to the basic question of subjectivity, who we are and how we come here, and in a global context, in which the local voices are constantly confronted with the threat of nationalism and conservatism. So what kind of context I'm lingering on here? To answer this question, a glimpse of the zeitgeist may be a good starting point for us. So maybe could we play the song? Oh shit, sorry. What did I do? Right? Sorry for that. The song is written by Cui Jian, one of the most prominent musicians in China. It's really fascinating, actually, the song, because the jump to the beat, which is, by the way, a good metaphor of the rapidly changing or progressing society of China. That leads to always create something new, even if it is hollow. So also the dialectal intonation and the genuine lyrics, all of this depicts the symptom of the era. For Cui Jian, it was actually the 1990s he was referring to as he wrote the song, but it didn't change much. So this is an era can often be visible through the lens of language. In the mid-90s, the linguistic critic, which grew up around artist Qiu Zhijie as his representative figure, influenced the works of many artists. In the resulting controversies, the visual language of cynical realism and political pop were placed in the court of the judgment. Emerging artists were dissatisfied with the illustrative nature of cultural symbolism and desperate to break free from this typical middle-class modes of thinking. If it can be said that the courage, prescience, and the clear political demands of this linguistic critic served to break down a certain formalized art historical narrative. By 2007 today, questions of visual language still appear not to have acquired a greater sense of their own contemporary relevance. So the issue has become far too embroiled with the market and our system, and this has led either to treating visual language as an end in itself, regardless of the means used for getting there, but paying close attention to the work's formal perfection, as well as its theoretical ambiguity, or else relying on the individual artist's talent, extracting certain kinds of linguistic logic from their foreign and domestic, individual and collective nomadic experiences. However, the earliest shadow cast by minimalism and Warhol are still there. These are the two artistic trends appropriated by the Chinese practitioners in the middle of, since the middle of the 1980s. They are still there. So even though in diluted form, in the various forms of technique employed by emerging Chinese artists, such as outsourcing labor, customization, engaging in institutional critique, environmentalism, parasitism, and participatory practices in general. Basically, this boils down to questions of whether it all amounts to studying the image as a means of simplifying things, or the reverse, and whether the whole thing takes on the guise of the political stance of the detached observer, because somebody will always say, this is not my age. Either way, it is a general confusion on or deliberate withdrawal from the labyrinth of market, art system, and growing globalization discourse. But language should not be seen as an essentialistic dynamic. It is a symptom of the zeitgeist, of the 4 decades from the end of the 1970s. Only through the appropriation of Western language and reconfiguration of local language that is to a great extent inherited from the socialist realism, the breakthrough can be achieved in the spirit of enlightenment. So we may wonder what lies behind the indulgence of language. So let's take a historical case, for example. I should have go to the next slide. This is actually about the indulgence of language. Okay. So let's take a historical case, for example. In 1956, on the orders of the Premier Zhou Enlai, the Peking Opera performance artist Cheng Yanqiu played the main character in a Peking Opera piece called Tears on a Barren Mountain, a Peking Opera film written and directed by the party dramatist Wu Zuguang. So apparently, because Cheng Yanqiu was a Peking Opera master, also the so-called founder of the Cheng Yanqiu school, who was already corpulent and, let's say, fat, actually, back then, devotedly presented more than 200 water sleeve movements. So, they plays with these long sleeves, and he kind of invented this 200 moves, working with these sleeves. So within this drama, it was the historical moment, short before the anti-right-wing movement was launched by Mao Zedong. Intellectuals and artists devoted themselves into conscious remolding of artistic forms, such as traditional theater and music, Chinese ink painting, and so on, and to be adaptive to the ideological framework and demands. Cheng Yanqiu's position in the 1950s was actually awkward. He had to, even though not reluctantly, change the way traditional opera was performed, write scripts with revolutionary narrative, and perform it with his swollen body in front of the politicians. However, Cheng chose to reform himself and entrust his artistic language to the state's historicist hallucinations and responsibilities. But what choice do we have now, in 2017? I mean, if we Chinese practitioners see ourselves coming out of the enclosed structure and that characterized the era between 1949 and 1976, do we have more choices than what was given to us before? Or do we, to a greater extent, still live in and live with the legacy of the political omnipotence? The artistic language, normally described as a dissident to the hegemony, does it break away from the ideological framework, or does it coincide with the authoritative appeal at different historical and political moments? So to address this question, I would like to make a statement first, and in the sense of value production. So we can all sense that, because all this big conference yesterday, so we can all sense that the value production in China today, there's a kind of a radical change taking place from the top to bottom. It is a value system that carries a dose of nihilism, and the economy is its only vehicle, and so economic value is all that is allowed to be expressed. In the meantime, the power orientation in the value production become increasingly radical, as we will see today. So this vulneration of the economic has permeated or spread the still inseparable cultural and political wars. To a great extent, the self-referential value production, the power for power's sake politics, and the political economic vacuum dictates the space for artistic creation, which in turn has two consequences. The first is a market-led artistic practice that does not examine reality with a critical approach, and the second is an aesthetic, formalist artistic discourse that places political or ideological references in the background without engaging further. Of course, these two situations are produced based on what the government will permit and what kinds of artistic attainments an artist can achieve. If we accept this argument, we will find out a parallel in the artistic production. So the self-referential quality in art becomes more and more visible as if it follows every step of the political evolution since the end of the 1970s. It is a shadow that authoritative politics casts on the cultural world. It may have been invisible after the 85 New Movement and in the 1990s, where individual practice cultivated itself and somehow was mobilized by the shaping of consumer society, in which politics seems to be tolerant of a partial handover of power. However, the political restraint and its omnipresence becomes visible again in the new era after 2012. With this in mind, I would like to bring up the issue I mentioned at the beginning regarding the exhibition practice in the project of permanent abstraction. In this exhibition, basically, I discussed the authoritative political and cultural framework and its impact on art practice, as well as the response of art on the level of individual practice. Since the late 1930s, Chinese art history has persistently shaped itself as a discursively and aesthetically impeccable history to respond to its radical political turn. However, the confrontation between history and the individual has not disappeared as a result of an enforced historical perspective and operations aimed at changing this history. Instead, the confrontation has evolved through the historical process of systemization and perfection to generate a unique force. One can consider the force of the metaphor or the force of abstraction, which means the tension growing out of the battle between art and politics to help us to understand how creative individuals assume their role in this historical process through the various acts of rejection, negotiation, compromise, or devotion. So in this context, we will discover that with these roundabout conversations with authoritative ideology as their communicative medium, art and politics, as well as history and the individual, have developed a mutually metaphorical relationship in certain political moments, where neither the individual nor the art is directly affected by politics, nor are they a means of escape. So in this project, I focus on the roundabout conversation between art and politics and on the security, or you can say the indirectness of the two parties. So not only it questions the universal dualistic understanding of the interrelation between art and politics, it also targets the universal art historical narrative that sees art as dissident in regard to the social role art has been playing since the 1980s. So what is this roundabout nature, this security or indirectness? I call it is kind of abstraction. So abstraction not in the sense of modern aesthetic genre, but an abstraction that possesses a certain kind of potential of historicizing the interrelation of art and politics. So in the following part, I will elaborate on this intermediary agents that art positions itself in the historical development. So the works that you will see in the following are not necessarily categorized into the socialist realism. Rather, it is a kind of lyrical serenade, as the title of my presentation suggests, so through which the creative individuals try to dialogue with the authoritative ideology. So through their artistic endeavor, they were able to express their artistic ideal in an abstract way, as well as consciously or subconsciously measure the ever-changing distance of art and politics. Let's start here. Yes, let's start here. Okay. During the this is the first case I want to show you. It is documentation and what materials I found during the research of this exhibition last year. It focuses on this let's say revolutionary artist Zhuang Yan, who arrived in Yan'an, the revolutionary base in the 40s, early 40s. And during the 1942 Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, he held an exhibition featuring his work and two other artists who had rushed to the front lines of anti-Japanese war as part of a delegation. So they visited soldiers fighting the Japanese, and their paintings depicting the scenes from their journey. After they came back to Yan'an, they made a series of works, and Zhuang Yan was one of the, let's say, one of the prominent artists in this group. So but the problem is, at this historical moment of the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, his work was criticized for being, I quote, too much like Matisse, and failing to be adaptive to the idea that culture and art should serve politics. So essays from opponents to the work, along with the artist's defense, were published in the Yan'an War newspaper, Compatriots. But the matter ended with Zhou Yang, director of the cultural department, Zhou Yang's publication of an article reflecting on the forum in Liberation Daily, the newspaper, entitled "Issues with Reforming Art Education." It was in this essay that any work that was so, I quote, deeply enamored or in love with Matisse was labeled incorrect. Obviously, these works, as you can see here, we don't see any shadows of Matisse actually in Zhuang Yan's work. It is actually the brushstrokes he used. They are flowing and in a kind of casual way, which was also actually related to the fact that he had to use all different materials to make his own paints, because oil paints were in short supply at that moment in Yan'an. So his colors are light, and his style does not conform to the criteria of realism. What interests me here is not the event itself, this Matisse debate, because there have been so many like it in Chinese art history. The case here is more like a metaphor of the very cultural and political context art sees itself in constantly. And there's a similar set of circumstances arose in 1957, when the fine arts news magazine Fine Arts Research 美术研究 published a debate about whether Impressionism is a kind of realism. So when this debate began, the two sides focused on the incorporating Western Impressionism into the recently established framework of Soviet realism, finding a position that would conform to the political reality of that time. So in the cultural and political history of the People's Republic of China, 1957 was a significant year, as we all know. So it is this year that Mao Zedong launched this anti-right-wing movement and changed the whole cultural landscape since then. So this discussion was eventually buried by the intense political shift from the more liberal airing of viewings to the more, let's say, a dangerous anti-rightist campaign. In the end, this brief discussion ended with self-criticisms published in Fine Arts Research Issue 4. So I highlighted these two cases not to simply point out that this harshness of the reality or this present nature of the reality and the innocence of art or the artist. So I have no interest in disregarding the individualism in artistic creation and concluding that art is politics. In fact, these events or cases and those like it fall within the overall authoritative framework. And although this framework has already been removed from contemporary art discourse, it has not completely disappeared from the art world. So instead, it has simply spread or taken up the residence in the background of these artworks and exerting influence based on the changes in existing cultural and political policy. This totality reflects the history of power, the historical and cultural consciousness produced by its domination, as well as the artistic value that is cultivated in the production of visual art. So there's no conflict between emphasizing the individuality and spiritual freedom of art and identifying the links between art and its historical circumstances. We can see that the birth and the growth of these paradoxical conceptions of time, which were also reflected in the two cases I have cited before, create a space for abstraction. The narrative thread provided by this project, permanent abstraction, resides in this space, while also borrowing a few metaphors to suggest and challenge the historical circumstances of this space. So this project attempts to engage in an experiment, examining without being limited by the interpretation of abstract images. Just give you an overall impression of this exhibition. So under the overall framework and through curatorial metaphor, we can propose a thick depiction of the composition of the canon of abstraction at different times. So here, abstraction is a space shaped by the two paradoxical conceptions of time, the authoritative time and the individual time. The discussions and works presented in this exhibition grew in this space, but they also question, transcend, and escape this space on a variety of levels. So on the foundation of metaphor, the exhibition narrates the artistic discussions and creations in this abstract space, further exploring whether abstraction is also a shadow mirrored in these discussions and artworks. So in the end, I hope that the curatorial effort, I will elaborate on that, will present art's reflection of this multi-tone shadow collectively mirrored in the totality and abstract space. So let's start with the work of Wu Dayu. Yeah, this is how they are showcased in the exhibition. This is Wu Dayu's work. So Wu Dayu is a Chinese modernist painter who studied in France in the 1920s and came back to Shanghai, and was one of the few Chinese painters who engaged themselves in the modernist fine art practice in China. Wu Dayu actually is also the tutor of Zhao Wuqi, Zhu Dechun, and Wu Guanzhong, and a generation of artists in China. But he was quite active in the mid of 1930s, but then got marginalized after the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Arts, especially after the discourse of this, Save the Nation become dominant throughout the country. And his entire creative output was marginalized after 1949, after the founding of the People's Republic of China, and his paintings were neither signed or not dated. So his artistic career does not seem to intersect with his times. Wu Dayu actually, he's the co-founder of the National Academy of Fine Arts in Zhejiang. And actually also he got a teaching position in the academy, but after the 1957, after the anti-rightist campaign, he was furtherly marginalized and somehow could not teach again in the university. So after that, Wu spent a larger part of his life working in seclusion. The fact that he did not date or sign his works inhibits any art historical desire to supply a beginning or an end of his overall works. In this exhibition, in the permanent abstraction in this exhibition, the work of Wu Dayu carries a special weight. Actually, the nature of his body of work remains essentially obscure for us. He was rediscovered actually in the middle of the 1980s as his student Wu Guanzhong somehow. Wu Guanzhong was the director of the 6th national exhibition and gave Wu Dayu an award, an honored award. But actually, he was quite marginalized after the Cultural Revolution. And ironically, his work were rediscovered actually by a Taiwanese gallery, Tina Keng Gallery. And the price goes high, of course. So, 3 minutes? Okay. Okay, then I will make it short. Wu's career after 1949, like I said, was a miserable one. So the abstract paintings he created seem to have lost its foundation for discussion in the socialist realism context. So his career is a story of modernity that does not seek historical validity, but historical contingency, and that does not strive for an artist's identity, but for multiple possibility. Operating deliberately between the fictions and the real, Wu's work could also be said to lurk within this exhibition while not actually being on view. Evidence that a historical phantom can always serve as an historical record. So in this exhibition, I will talk about just a bit about the exhibition practice here. This exhibition used two narrative metaphors, continuation and repetition, to explore the tension of an abstract space that lies outside of the abstract painting and techniques. Separated between the two rooms, because I was offered two exhibition rooms at Red Brick Museum, and it was really difficult actually to somehow develop a kind of a route or let's say a conventional exhibition design in these circumstances. So I used these two rooms, and there are works or cases that repetitively appear in the two rooms. So there's a repetition involved in the exhibition aesthetic. The mirrored vocabularies of these two rooms is a bit like the A and B side of the tape. Identity and difference are interwoven in expressing the tension-filled relationship between the individual's trace of time and the historical time view and its authoritative frameworks. Let me give you another example. Yeah, Pang Xunqin. Pang Xunqin was also active in the 1930s in Shanghai. Also studied in French and came back to Shanghai, and so very addicted to modern art, especially to decorative art of the West. So Pang Xunqin had been active throughout the 30s, but then he changed his way of practice at the beginning of the 1940s. So this is the painting he created in 1943, which is called The Son of the Earth. It is actually also still a very aesthetic one. Actually, it also reminds me of this Picasso style, this leaning heads and this non-perspective approach. But it's called The Son of the Earth. So it actually depicts the so-called three mountains, oppress the Chinese folk: the imperialism, feudalism, and colonialism. So somehow Pang seeks the opportunity to dialogue with the zeitgeist. He tries to somehow negotiate with the politics or the dominant political ideology at the time, save the country. So this is another way of dialogue. Wu Dayu somehow applies this kind of a very radical way. He rejects to have any connection with the zeitgeist and the outside circumstances. But Pang Junqin in Pang Junqin's case is a more milder one. He tries to come out of his own tone. So I think I'm out of time. Yeah, just one more case, maybe to let you know why, in what sense I'm practicing this exhibition, like this one. This is actually I'm going off the script. A painting I found out during my research in Shanghai. It's called Plowing the Sea, made by artists Tang Guoxiang and Yu Jihong in 1974, which was actually a losing moment, towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. So the whole image narrative changed. This so-called Hong Guang Liang, the shining, I don't know how to translate it, the shining glory image of the social workers, social worker and heroes were changed in a way. But this is not, let's say, not a contingency. So in this exhibition, I found out in the China Pictorial, one of the most prominent magazines at the time in the 1970s, some images that depicts with the same approach as this painting suggests. So it depicts the landscape, from the 45-degree angle. So the seagulls in the foreground dialogues with this small machine in the background. So there's no human being involved in this image, which was quite rare at that time, during the Cultural Revolution. But I somehow try to restore this historical context to see what's the origin of this image narrative. Also, this is also a good case. This is my last case, I promise. Wu Yinxian, actually, let's say he's a system photographer, arrived in Yan'an at the end of the 1930s, and devoted to the revolution. He was one of the most important photographers in China and founded the Chinese Photography Academy in Beijing, and one of the most important theoreticians in the art world. Wu Yinxian took this series of photos called Rally during a conference in Yan'an in 1943. I think it's called something memorial to the working heroes in Yan'an, something like that, because Yan'an at that time was experiencing this difficult time of agriculture. So Mao Zedong somehow wanted to mobilize the folk in Yan'an to together come through these difficulties. But the situation in this picture is that the conference was held in an inner space, and the light was low, and the film was also very old actually, so he could not capture Mao in a sharp way. But then Wu Yinxian found out there was a way to capture Mao, because when Mao gave speeches, Mao somehow paused, in a conscious or subconscious way. So he captured this pause and captured all these moments to make these series of photos. So in the exhibition, in the two exhibition rooms, I presented two series. The one is sharp, the other one is not. So not only to emphasize this contingency of art making, but also somehow to showcase a kind of a metaphoric space, embedded in this in this series of images. It is the hollowness of political nature. It is the performative nature of politics at all. So I kind of use this very strong curatorial language somehow to interpret all images involved in this exhibition, to somehow to discuss this intermediary quality of art and how art dialogues with the zeitgeist and ideologies. I think I'm going to stop here because we don't have time anymore. Thank you.